If someone tells me a game takes several hours to get good, my immediate feeling is that I will never play that game. Who has hours to waste waiting for the good part of anything when there are so many other games to play? But my opinion of Rise of the Ronin changed drastically over the course of my 50-hour playtime. In the first 5 or 10 hours, I didn't really like it. By the end, I was planning to dive back in to clear out side quests and replay key moments to see how the story might change. It's a game that takes its time getting good, but once it finds its footing in samurai sword duels and character-focused missions, your investment pays off. The thing that turned the tide for me is the way Rise of the Ronin focuses on telling small, character-driven stories that weave together into a larger history-shaping narrative. The entire game is built on its bond system, where doing side quests big and small builds your relationship with everyone, from the different provinces of Ronin's massive open-world Japan to the many characters you meet throughout the course of the game. Though the bond system isn't particularly different from building up faction reputation, liberating map segments, or growing relationship stats with characters you might see in other games, the focus on investing in all those things in people is illustrative of Team Ninja's approach to the entire game. Your personal connection to everything in Rise of the Ronin is what makes it work, and the reason why it's worth it to power through its learning curve and less remarkable opening hours. Rise of the Ronin puts you into the role of a samurai trained alongside another warrior from childhood to be an unstoppable, sword-wielding fighting duo for a group called the Veiled Edge. It's the 1860s, and Japan is opening itself to foreign powers, including the United States and England, creating political strife. On a mission to assassinate a powerful American, your Blade Twin sacrifices themselves so you can escape. Soon after, the rest of the Veiled Edge is wiped out for rebelling against Japan's government, the Shogunate. You set out alone, a Ronin warrior without a clan, but soon discover your Blade Twin is rumored to have survived. What ensues is a lot of politics, intrigue, and adventure. With no clan to serve, you essentially become a sword for hire, and lots of people want your help, which you exchange for leads in finding your Blade Twin. The main part of Rise of the Ronin's gameplay is stealthily sneaking up on enemies to assassinate them and fighting duels. Combat has a similar fast-paced feel to games like Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice and Ghost of Tsushima, with an emphasis on pairing enemies at the right moment and using different fighting styles to counter your opponent. Fights are frenetic, but for that early portion they're also frustrating thanks to a combination of weird controls and enemies who will often deploy intense, overwhelming force against you. You and every fighter you come across have both a health bar and ki gauge, which is akin to a stamina meter. Ki powers every blow, dodge, and block, and if you run out of ki and are struck while blocking, you will be dazed for a few seconds, opening you up to more punishment. Your goal in every fight, especially with tougher opponents, is to strike blows while parrying their attacks, breaking their rhythm, and whittling down their ki to stagger them. When staggered, most normal enemies can be executed, while tougher foes and bosses take a big hit and then get their ki back to go another round. It sounds pretty standard, especially with the ubiquity of Souls-likes and the similar styles of swordplay focused on parrying stamina and breaking an enemy's posture. Rise of the Ronin has its own take on the approach though, and it took me a while to build up the skill to actually enjoy it. The main two elements of sword fights are martial attacks, which are powerful special moves, and counter sparks, which are flowery parry moves. Like Sekiro and its posture system, your main goal in Rise of the Ronin is to parry enemy blows until you can stagger them. But counter sparks are kind of weird, especially at first. They're not just straight parries, they're fast, short-range attacks with their own forward momentum. Missing the timing on a parry usually means you still hit the opponent and the opponent hits you. But there are plenty of times when a counter spark can move you past the enemy altogether. It creates a strange flow to your fight movements that takes a lot of getting used to. Rise of the Ronin borrows a bit from Souls-like combat in that enemies will sometimes power through your strikes with their own attack animations, so you need to recognize when to attack and when to hold back. Yet Ronin wants fights to be fast and aggressive, so if you counter-spark certain attacks, you'll knock the enemy off balance and open up for a brief counter-strike opportunity. This creates an unusual rhythm. You can counter-spark most of a combo chain from an enemy to no benefit, because the only attack that truly matters for parrying is the last or the strongest in the chain. That means your strategy should actually be to safely block your way through a series of attacks and counter-spark only the final move. That requirement makes countersparks unintuitive because the urge to parry has to be strategically resisted. Sometimes you can skillfully parry a bunch of moves in a row and wind up being punished for it anyway. Other times you may be rewarded just for hammering the button against a tough opponent. Mostly though, you're spending the first few battles against any tough opponent trying to figure out when the correct time to parry is, and getting demolished by quick, relentless strikes in the meantime. It's not a bad parry system. I came to enjoy Rise of the Ronin's approach quite a bit once I understood how it worked and could start to read its enemies and their attacks. But the extra motion and timing are at odds with similar games, so you'll have to unlearn a few things to acclimate yourself. Especially early on, this combat pacing is annoyingly brutal. One particular early boss fight had a massive difficulty spike that held me back for a couple of hours. For a game that easily lasts more than 50 hours and has a similar fight at the end of every single mission, being stuck on the same boss for that long was grueling. Fortunately, Rise of the Ronin lets you change the difficulty whenever you want, so you can drop it to its easier mode if a fight is giving you trouble, then increase the challenge once you're over the hump. What makes fighting a bit wonky is Rise of the Ronin's control scheme, which is convoluted and unintuitive. Blocking attacks is done by holding the left bumper, but parrying is done with the triangle button. The separation of your defensive moves requires specific training for your brain. Hold this button for this kind of attack, tap this button for another kind, but mix the two together as well. It's enough to jumble you up until you've spent enough time getting used to the specific approach. Eventually, all these controls became natural for me, but it took a while to get there. The Blade Twins story isn't a particularly compelling one, and while it's the frame device that's supposed to drive your character, it doesn't get a lot of screen time. But Rise of the Ronin picks up quite a bit as your investigation pushes you to start making friends with various people who either support the stability of the shogunate or think that the country needs a new government. As time goes on, those different people develop into separate factions that will require your help and which you can choose to aid. However, it all leads to an open world setup that's somewhat unremarkable. A lot of the open world content in Rise of the Ronin feels set to the standard of the 2010s era games, with some repetitive activities that will pop up randomly in front of you, some collectibles to chase down, and some side quests to complete that tend to end up with you killing some random baddies. Story missions and side quests are more interesting and involved, although they also get repetitive. Most of these put you into a level where you infiltrate a location, sneak around assassinating rank-and-file soldiers, get seen and fight some guys, and then defeat a boss. These missions suffer in part because Rise of the Ronin's stealth is a bit undercooked. It can be unreliable, with enemies sometimes spotting you from far off with little issue and other times being totally oblivious as you fight pitched, protracted battles with their friends 10 feet behind them. Missions always end with excellent challenging boss fights though, and once you get good at Rise of the Ronin's dueling system, every fight becomes a combat puzzle mixing twitch reactions and strategic responses that continually make them exciting. Stealth breaks up the fighting just enough to help mission pacing while rewarding you for analyzing the environment and planning your approach, even if it'll sometimes annoy you by failing at key moments. Stealth is more a nice-to-have addition than essential to the formula. The best of Rise of the Ronin's levels are its bond missions. You'll meet a ton of samurai and join many of them in missions as allies, creating ongoing relationships. You can then enhance your friendship with these folks by completing side missions that flesh out their stories and engaging in conversations or giving them gifts. Building stronger bonds unlocks new fighting styles as well as passive bonuses when you bring them on missions. But the most interesting part is the way each character's individual stories expand across missions and add to the overall narrative. The characters are all well drawn, dealing with their own principles and motivations, and their stories are worth experiencing on their own. Having personal ties to all these characters makes the overall story a lot deeper, Rise of the Ronin tells a fictionalized version of the historical end of the shogunate and the samurai lifestyle in the 1860s, with the characters and events you're engaged with eventually pushing Japan towards civil war and your own principles and relationships causing you to switch sides numerous times. That means a character you brought as an ally on one mission might be a boss you have to face down in another, and your connection to all of Rise of the Ronin's characters does a lot to raise the stakes and make the entire narrative feel personally important. So while Rise of the Ronin has some elements that can frustrate or require some investment to make sense of, and weaker elements like some open world design that comes off as dated or some repetition in level design, it does a great job of getting you invested in what's going on and the people involved. Bond missions in particular are a standout, but a mix of personal stakes and large-scale politics make the historical story compelling all the way through. The longer you play Rise of the Ronin, the more characters you meet and spend time with, and the more you learn about its combat and its world, the better it becomes. And while it took a while to find the rhythm of Rise of the Ronin's combat, its speed, complexity, and intensity make for some phenomenal fights that always feel great to win. Rise of the Ronin is a game that might take a bit to get good, but the commitment is worth it.
3 centuries ago, Japan was unified under the Tokugawa shogunate. It closed its doors to the rest of the world. For a time, the island nation prospered. Yet despite its apparent tranquility, conflict brewed beneath the surface. Feudal lords known as daimyo were kept under strict surveillance. In public, they were loyal.